Right, well, everybody, welcome. Well, I'm extremely excited. It's not every day I get to do this. It's the first time I've ever done it, in fact, and I'm absolutely delighted. My name is Mark Dinverno, and I am now in the Academy of Music in Hong Kong Baptist University. And like my guest today, I'm an academic looking at music and technology and performance, and also a jazz musician. And as you will know, we have been looking at the art of improvisation with Keith Jarrett. And as I was doing all the research on the course with the thousands of links, I came across this probably about the second week, and I absolutely loved the book. And I thought it was kind of beautiful the way it balanced kind of cultural understanding and musicological understanding and philosophical understanding. And I thought it captured the Con concert better than everything else I've seen. And I wrote to Peter, and Peter has very kindly given us his time. And before I'm going to introduce him, so Peter is a musicologist, a researcher. He's senior lecturer at the University of Hull. He concentrates on many things: jazz studies, improvisation, popular music, sound studies. And so he understands the kind of whole world from jazz to pop to rock. And like me, he's a jazz musician, and we will hear him play later because, unlike me, he can actually read music, and he's a musicologist, unlike me as well. So I'm very excited. Now, you know, this is really special, this book, and so I would recommend that you go and buy it, students, because it's Oxford University Press, probably our most prestigious publisher. And like I said before, it's kind of the combination of a musical, cultural, historical, aesthetic look at the Con concert. So, Peter, thank you very much. It's kind of partly improvised this, and partly I've got some notes. But I suppose, Peter, what is your first memory of Keith Jarrett? Why did you get sucked into it? What's the story of you and Keith Jarrett?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Mark, for inviting me. It's really nice to be here virtually. Sorry I can't see everyone who's going to be watching this, but I hope you find it enjoyable. So, my history with Keith Jarrett. When I was about 18, I was just, I think, nearing the end of my time in school. I was about to go to university. I started to get interested in jazz. And at that time, living in the UK, the internet didn't, as we know it now, didn't really exist. So the only way to really find out about jazz was, and because there was no one really local to me who knew anything about it, there were no teachers or anything, the only way to find out was to go to your local library and read books and to listen to the radio. So those are the two things I did. So as I was reading a few histories of jazz, I came across this name, Keith Jarrett, and read some things about him. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I must, when I get the chance, see what he sounds like. And then one of the things I would do, in the UK, we used to have a radio show, and you'll probably remember this, Mark, hosted by a very famous jazz musician called Humphrey Littleton.
Of course,
he used to have a show on, right.
He reviewed one of my albums, Peter. Would you believe? He said something very nice about So
yeah. Well,
like
he had
Humphrey.
He had a show on. He had a show on the BBC, and every week, I think it was a Monday night, and he would play lots of different records for about 2 hours.
It was called Best of Jazz on Record, wasn't it, Peter?
I think it was. I can't even remember what it was called now. But I remember during that was the first moment I heard Jarrett. And I can tell you actually what I heard. There were two, I can't remember which came first, but there were two of his recordings with the very famous trio with Jack DeJohnette and Gary Peacock.
Right.
One of them was a version of All the Things You Are, very famous jazz standard. And the other one was a version, I think, of Billy's Bounce, which is a blues by Charlie Parker.
Right.
And I immediately heard something in the music that really, really fascinated me. And it's very hard to explain what it was, but there was a kind of quality of sort of joy and spontaneity to it that I wasn't hearing in a lot of other jazz. That's not to say it's not there in a lot of other jazz, but there was something coming through which immedately hooked me. And that was the start of it. Just hearing those two things.
And it's amazing you remember the actual tracks. That's quite something. And it was Monday night, listening to Best of. That's fantastic. And were you playing at that time, Peter? Were you playing jazz or were you playing classical? What's your music background up to that point?
So yeah, my background is kind of interesting. Well, no, it's not interesting. It's actually quite typical, I think. I was brought up studying classical music, so right. I was a pianist and I was a clarinetist, and I also played the church organ a little bit.
Great.
And And when I went to university, at that time in the UK, when you went to university to do a music degree, you didn't really do jazz. You did classical music. So when I went to university, there was one jazz module you could do, which was the history of jazz. But that was it. And at this time, I was growing up in Belfast. And if you know anything about Belfast in the 1990s, we had relatively little culture because of some of the political problems going on at the time. Yes. So it wasn't like you couldn't just go out down the road to hear some jazz. It just was, there was very little you could go to hear. But I was still interested in jazz. So in about 1996, I made the decision to do a PhD. And I decided to do it on Keith Jarrett, and I moved to Southampton, which you'll probably know very well, Mark.
Yeah,
I spent a long
absolutely.
time there, and that was my first real exposure to jazz, because I every single week I would be at the jazz club at the University of Southampton listening to music, and I kind of made the decision at that point. Right, I'm gonna focus on teaching myself how to play jazz properly.
Okay, so quite late. You were 18, 19.
Yeah,
no, you would have been
quite late.
22.
After
your degree.
My 20s. In my 20s. So obviously I had technique, because I'd been taught classically. I had a technique that was okay, but there's a huge amount that you have to learn that's very different if you're coming from a classical background. It's a very different kind of discipline. So what I did was, I suppose it's quite nerdy, but I literally I had a practice routine of doing 2-5-1s, so basically playing a 2-5-1 progression around every single key.
So it's just to tell the students what it's D minor, C7, C, and then you'd go up, then sort of C minor 7, F7, B flat major 7. Okay, just so the students
all that
got
stuff.
it.
And I'd go around every single key, and I'd make sure that I knew all the different ways of playing the chords and what we call the extensions and the alterations, the different ways you can alter the notes chromatically. And that was how I felt, how I got myself into a place where I could even just start trying to get used to the jazz language. That was my way into it.
How did you get the touch, though, the feel? Because we'll talk about it later, but the approach to playing classical is so different to playing jazz. How did you lose the classical training and be able to kind of like swing, as it were, in a sort of different way? Do you remember?
I'm not sure I do. I mean, I think that's the hardest thing. That was the hardest thing for me, by far. I think I started out, as we all probably do, just imitating what I was hearing on records.
Yes. So listening.
And at one point, I remember though, I had a gig, and I was starting to play a bit, and I was playing with two other students, and we were playing a gig without a drummer. And it was during the course of that gig I realised how bad my time was. And you probably know, when we talk about time in jazz, we talk about just our sense of pulse and rhythmic feel. So that was the moment where I realised, okay, I'm going to have to do some really serious work here to sort this out. So my approach was really, and I still don't have great time, but my approach was simply to do what most people say. You work with a metronome, and you put your metronome on, and you play with the metronome. But the key thing is, you get used to having the metronome on beats 2 and 4.
Yeah.
So rather than having the metronome clicking on 1 and 3, you're
right.
clicking on 2 and 4, and that orients you towards feeling the 2 and 4 emphasis, and just starts helping you solidify the time. So that was what I was working on for quite a long time.
I think that'd be very helpful to our students who are essentially classically trained, but actually today we had some trying to play jazz, and it was absolutely fantastic, Peter. So that's really great advice. I guess my kind of like question is, do you remember now listening to the Colne concert for the first time, and what moved you to spend all of this research effort in investigating it? What's that story?
Yeah, okay. So I suppose there's two parts to it. So the first part is that when I went to university, we had this is again before the internet, really.
Could you say when did you go to university?
Sorry.
What year was it?
So I went to university in 1991.
Gotcha.
And I think in the UK we first really started using the internet around 1994.
Right.
Obviously, but this is a long time ago, before anything like YouTube or Spotify. So at university we had a little music library, which had a huge cupboard full of records. And what I used to do is, between my lectures, I'd simply go and pull out records and sit and listen to them. And I gravitated towards all the jazz things, and there was a copy of the Cologne concert. And I think at the time I knew I probably had a couple of other Keith Jarrett albums, but that was the first time I listened to it. Um, and I think the first time I heard it, it has something very, very particular. Some people describe it as having something special, but it has a particular feel and quality to it, and it's very hard not to immediately get that when you hear it.
Yes.
So the longer story of how I came to write about it, that's a slightly longer story. So when I did my PhD, I started my PhD in 1996. I finished in 2001. That was all about Keith Jarrett's solo concert improvisations.
So, all of it is kind of whole range from 73. No, okay.
No. I actually, when I started, I thought I was going to write about everything. What I ended up doing was writing really only about a particular set of albums from 1973 called Solo Concerts, which is the first recording Jarrett made of these solo improvised concerts. So I sort of ended up writing a thesis which was all about the history of the idea of improvisation during the 1960s and how you get to this moment in 73, more or less, where Jarrett starts playing these improvised concerts. So I didn't go past 1973. And then quite a few years later, I'd done quite a few other things. The opportunity came up to do a book for Oxford University Press in this series they had called Studies in Recorded Jazz. And initially I was actually thinking about writing about a completely different Keith Jarrett record.
Which one?
I was actually, my first idea was actually a record called Expectations.
Yes.
Right, which is a very, very different record. It's not a solo record, it's Jarrett with, I think, a sort of expanded version of his quintet, if I remember right. And
so Charlie Hayden, Paul Motion.
Charlie Hayden, Paul Motion, Dewey Redman.
Yeah.
And I think there is a string quartet on that record as well at some point. Right. So it's quite an expanded sort of instrumentation. And it then kind of became clear that the publisher really wanted a book on the Cologne concert.
Right.
And I think, the reasons for that are obvious. It's a record that a lot of people know really well.
Yes.
It's quite famous. It's the statistics say it's the best-selling solo piano record of all time.
Yes.
And I think the publisher felt that this was a book that they could connect with a very broad audience who'd be interested in it. And so I thought about it and thought, okay, that wasn't what I was going to do, but actually, someone's going to write this book. Someone is going to write a book about the Cologne concert. Why don't I do it? Because I know a lot about this already. And so that's what I did. And it was a lot of fun doing it, actually. I'm really glad I did.
So that's great, because that's answered one of the first questions from our MA cohort. So which leads me... So one of them, I mean, the students really have not accessed this material again. So we're spending a lot of time listening and a lot of time understanding just how extraordinary improvisation is. But do you have a sense about why, and I know you talk about this in your book, first of all, why is the Cologne concert so popular? And second, why is it so popular amongst piano players like us? Do you have a view on that, Peter?
Oh, okay. Why it's so popular? I think it's a complicated question. I think maybe I'll talk about two sides to it. So I think the first part is the musical part of it. So I think that actually, if you listen to all of Jarrett's solo improvised concerts from the 1970s, right. And there are actually quite a lot on record that you can listen to. There's also quite a lot more bootlegs that are out there on the internet that you can find on YouTube.
Does this go back to Facing You 1971, and then he started playing?
So he basically started playing these concerts, I think, in 72 in Germany.
Yeah. Okay.
So you can actually, if you look really hard, there are some recordings of some of the very first ones he played, and you can kind of hear, you can trace it and hear how it developed if you want to. But for me, the Cologne concert, the musical language of the Cologne concert is a little bit different from almost any of his other concerts, in the sense that it's generally, more of it is very straightforwardly diatonic than a lot of the other concerts.
Can you say what you mean by diatonic?
So what I mean by diatonic is when you have harmony that's basically all based around major and minor chords.
Right.
Now in jazz we tend to throw lots of other things into the mix. When we have these major minor chords, we like to alter them and so throw other things in. So if I try playing something, if I play you some D major chord, that comes through.
Yes, it does.
That's a very straight diatonic chord. Now, if you give that to a jazz musician, they might start, for fooling around with it and altering that chord by introducing chromatic elements to it.
Like
So
you flatten the
extending the length of
ninth
the
or
chord.
you sharpen
Yeah,
the fifth, that kind of thing. Yeah.
all of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the language of the Cologne concert, more of it is based on straightforward triads
Right.
than almost, I think, most of his other concerts. There are very long passages where the harmony is basically just triads. So if you were to make a musical argument for why it's popular, I think it would probably rest on the fact that a lot of people do find it very accessible because a lot of the harmony is quite straightforward and quite open. I mean, Jarrett does do it very cleverly because it's got, although it sounds simple, it has got the sophistication to how he's doing it. There is a kind of slightly broader question about why it's popular as a cultural thing, which maybe we'll save for a separate question because that's potentially quite a big answer. As to why it's popular with piano players, I'm not really sure, and I think that that question might be slightly different for jazz players as opposed to more regular piano players, if that's the right way of putting it. There are jazz musicians I know who kind of created their own versions of the Cologne concert. Some of them play it note for note. They go out and do concerts and they play every single note exactly the same. There are other people who use it as a kind of way of improvising, and they kind of use some of the basic ideas Jarrett set up, but do their own versions of it, so that there is still a lot of improvisation involved in it. But I think that's relatively recent as far as I can tell. I think for most jazz musicians, it's more the underlying ideas that Jarrett's using and the way he's generating the material that's kind of been very popular. But for piano players more generally, one of the other things about this that's important is that you can buy a transcription of it.
Yes.
I've got it here just in case. I mean, your students might be interested. I'm sure you can find this, but it is a complete transcription of the whole thing, note for note. So if you want to play it, you can buy it, put it on your music stand, and you can try it. And that makes it very accessible in a way that the other records aren't, because there aren't really transcriptions of the other records. So if you want to learn them, there's a huge amount of work in transcribing them, working out what the notes are, and then trying to do that yourself. So this is a shortcut if you want to work out how Jarrett plays and get into that.
I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? Actually, now, Peter, if you go online, I think the Sun Bear concerts are now available as transcriptions online, and there seems to be hundreds of these beautiful gifts that people have left us. But it does, because for many classical musicians, this is kind of the Bible in some sense. It's what we get from Mozart and Bach and Shostakovich, which is, kind of mainstream of what our musicians are learning. But tell us what you think the relationship between this and the performances. When it's the other way around in improvised music, what is the relationship between this and what we hear?
Okay, so a nice way of describing this is something that it's a term we sometimes use in the university I teach in, and I'll try and explain it. And what we sometimes say is that often scores prescribe performances, whereas this score is describing.
Very good.
So what that means is, I mean, I didn't come up with that. It's very nice. I had to say it. I didn't come up with that. It's very nice. So what that means is that when a score prescribes a performance, the score is a set of instructions that you follow to create that performance. And the score is almost like a set of rules. It's telling you what to do. This is the other way round. The score is an attempt to describe something that has already happened.
Yes.
So the Cologne concert has already happened. So the notation is there to help us describe the notes Jarrett played and how he played them. And of course, one of the things is that as soon as you try and do any transcription like this, you become aware that it's always going to be quite imperfect. It's an attempt to put down onto paper what Jarrett played, but it's only an attempt. There are probably lots of subtleties in what he did that we haven't captured. There are probably even mistakes in there somewhere. So that, yes, you can sit down and attempt to play the music from the score, but I think you have to really know the recording first in order to do it, would be my view.
So yes, that's a really nice way. It describes or intends to kind of distill in some way what
Yeah,
happened. And Jarrett had an, I mean, we'll talk. He had an uneasy relationship with this, didn't he? Even though it was authorized in the end, he worked with two
yeah,
Japanese. He did work with them. You know, he was
yeah.
okay about this happening, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
And
I think that, yeah. I mean, I think Jared's unease with it is actually more to do with the whole of the concert and the whole of the recording rather than the transcription. Although I think it includes the transcription, and I think it's something that happens sometimes. I think sometimes when you have an artist, you create something that ends up becoming very, very, very popular.
right.
They end up having a difficult relationship with that thing because they feel that it overshadows some of the other things they do. And I think very clearly Jarrett feels that the Cologne concert has overshadowed a lot of his other recordings. And I actually think there are actually a lot of other solo concert recordings that I would prefer to listen to than the Cologne concert. Because I think they're a better representation of what Jarrett was trying to do than that concert is. There's actually a strange parallel, almost the best parallel is the example of the French composer Ravel and this piece he wrote called Bolero.
Yes.
Some of your students might know. It's an
Yes.
extremely famous piece, and I think Ravel had the same feeling about it, that he hated having written it because it had become so popular that it was doing a similar thing. Other people were forgetting the other things he'd written because of that one piece. So I think that, yeah, this happens sometimes. I think that when you get something very popular, the person who created it has mixed feelings about it.
That's very interesting, and I mean, I think he once said that he'd wish it had never happened, but
Yeah.
it's given so many people, including myself, so much joy over the years. Um, yeah. Okay. So I've got another question about. I suppose this is now going to touch upon. You said part of it was musicological, but part of it was about the historical, cultural, narrative story. So it's become folklore, and why do there's a film just come out from Germany about 50 called Colne 75. Is it about triumph over adversity? Is it about constraints driving creativity? If you had to summarize what it is that the other parts of the Colne concert, which other than music lend itself to having this place in the history of music, can you talk about that, Peter?
Yeah, so I think that there is a very, very well known story about the concert that's been told many, many, many times. It was told, I think, initially by Jarrett himself, and then his record label boss, who was with him, is a man called Manfred Eicher. He's told the story as well, and the story basically goes that he'd been playing in Switzerland the night before. They'd driven through the night to get to the city of Cologne, so they hadn't slept.
You
They
said it was
got there.
500 miles in your book. I'd never heard that.
Did
You
I?
said-
Yeah. Okay. Whatever it was, it was a long, long
Yeah.
way, and they were driving in, I think, an old Renault or something.
That's right.
So it wasn't
Yeah.
what we would describe as a comfortable modern car, right? They got to the city of Cologne. They were playing at the Cologne Opera House, and the concert had been organised by a young student called Vera Brandis, who was probably appearing, I think, in some of these recent films
Yes.
about the concert.
Yes.
So she'd organised this concert, but for whatever reason, there was a strike, I think, on the day of the concert. So the piano that was on the stage, as I understand it, wasn't the proper piano, it was the rehearsal piano. And they couldn't get the people involved to change it for the proper concert piano. And the rehearsal piano had quite a lot of problems. I'm not quite clear what they were, but it was obviously in substandard condition. So at the time, there was a lot of doubt about whether Jarrett would perform, I suspect because he was reluctant to perform because the piano wasn't up to standard, and he was extremely picky about the quality of the pianos he played on. Apparently then, I think another part of the story I've heard only recently is that they went to a restaurant and the food made him ill or
Yes.
something like that. I'm not
Yeah.
quite sure. For whatever reason, anyway, he agreed to do the concert, went on to play it. By his own account, almost falling asleep, so obviously extremely tired.
Yes.
Played the concert, forgot about it, and it was then when they listened to the tape in the car a few days later that they first heard what they'd captured. And according to the story, it kind of became clear to them that they knew immediately that there was something on the tape that was maybe worth releasing. So in that sense, it's a very traditional story of triumph over adversity. The concert shouldn't have happened. All these things went wrong. So without a doubt, that's part of the kind of mystique behind it, the reason it's got all these stories attached to it. One thing I would say, and I kind of maybe caution your students about this, when you're dealing with historical stuff like this, it's always really important to know that when people tell you these stories, they're often not quite as straightforward as they might seem. And I can't really go into the details, but I've corresponded with some of the various people involved, and it probably won't surprise you to know that they don't all see it in the same way.
That's very interesting.
And there are slightly conflicting views about certain things. There is also other things that I've heard that were involved, or kind of events connected to the concert that have not become public knowledge. They may never become public knowledge, but all those things I think simply serve to say that these stories that we get about music and how it's created, they're not often as simple as they seem, and they're stories told by different people from different vantage points. And even if you watch one of these films, it's a representation of something. It's not really the truth. The truth is something we'll probably never really know properly. But yeah, it's not quite as simple as all the stories might have.
I'm sure. I heard there was another film coming out, actually, and we're not going to touch on that, about actually trying to find that piano. And actually, is it as bad as they thought? But anyway, we should. So this question is from one of my BA students, and it sort of touches on why you think the concert might be triads, for example, as you said. How do you think the piano, the location, the concert hall, the acoustics and the audience affect the improvisations that Jarrett plays on that night, Peter?
Totally, completely, absolutely. I think one of the things that's really interesting about Keith Jarrett's recorded output, especially from maybe the 1980s onwards, if you look at it, the vast majority of it is live. Live recordings. And if you look at what he says, he obviously has a very strong, passionate belief that music is something that you create in front of an audience, in a particular place, and that it is a result of the kind of interface between the audience and the performer. And I think if you read what he says and you watch him play, I think it's very clear that because of the way he's improvising and the way he's listening, he's extremely delicately attuned to everything that's going on in the concert hall he's in. So every little sound the audience makes, everything the piano is doing, is obviously to him extremely important in kind of how the music ends up being the way it is. So in that sense, I'd say, yeah, absolutely. The place where it's recorded and the circumstances have a lot to do with how the music comes out that way. Now, whether you can actually go to any of the recordings and start understanding why they are the way they are because of that context, that's a different question, and that's a difficult question. But basically, yes, absolutely.
I mean, you did say that you, again in your book, that you thought there was more influence from the Beatles and Dylan, who we know that Jarrett listened to, right? And more triadic, perhaps, than more complex or more free. So do you think, after all the analysis that you've done, that the piano being slightly weaker impacted on Jarrett becoming a little bit more mainstream, if you like, and more accessible in his improvisations?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, a lot of people have speculated this. I think there's probably definitely something in that. Yeah. I mean, basically, Jarrett was one of a whole generation of musicians, including people like Gary Burton and Pat Metheny, who there might not be names your students know, but they may be worth knowing a bit about. But a lot of these quite young musicians who were kind of coming up during the 1960s, they were listening a lot to the new popular music of the time by the Beatles and Bob Dylan and people like that.
Yes.
And that music didn't have the same harmonic language as conventional jazz did. And what you find, especially in Pat Metheny's early work and in a lot of Jarrett's early compositions, is a very different way of dealing with harmony from traditional jazz, something that's much simpler, much more based on these triads. Jarrett recorded some Bob Dylan covers on one of his records. There's a record where he records a version of My Back Pages, Bob Dylan's song, and there is a bootleg out there somewhere, which I think someone has titled the Dylan Concert.
Okay.
Which is a kind of clever play on words. But it's basically, I think it's a set of Jarrett playing Bob Dylan songs. So there's a very clear influence in there, and yeah, it does seem kind of that, you know, when Jarrett had the substandard piano, he was relying on these quite open chords with quite open harmonies, playing things that he knew weren't going to sound too discordant, perhaps. I'm not sure. I mean, this is all speculative, but I think there's definitely something there about how that musical language came out in that circumstance. Yeah.
So another. In fact, just before I ask that question, there's something quite profound that you speak about in the book, and some of my students are actually going to write about this. You talk about mediation, and so does Jarrett. And there's an argument that says, and I think you make this beautifully, but let me just, essentially, to experience the art of improvisation, you need to be physically present in the room with it happening, and you're part of it. And that even the record is a kind of mediation between. Can you talk us through that? But can you also, as you know, talk us through why we get such a strong sense of being in the room when we're listening to it as well, Peter, if you would.
So maybe what would be helpful, because I think mediation is quite a complex idea. Okay. So, I mean, if it's all right, I'll kind of give you the explanation that I use with my students, which is great. I think they find it helpful. So what I always say is mediation is a process, but it's not simple communication. So it's a process where one thing gets somehow transformed on its way to you. And the best example that we came up with in the class I teach is actually, if you think about a pane of glass. So if you look through a pane of glass, maybe out at a landscape, so you imagine that pane is incredibly clean, so that you almost can't see it's there.
Yes.
So you can look through the glass at the landscape, and you can see the landscape almost perfectly as it is. So while the glass is doing something really subtle in allowing the light through to you, it's as if it's not there. So that's almost unmediated, or the mediation is really, really hard to see. But imagine that you're looking through glass that's got maybe a blue filter on it. Right? So you're still seeing the landscape, but now it's blue. So clearly what's happening now is that as the light from the landscape gets through to you, it's being transformed by the glass to be blue. And now the mediation is much clearer. So when you have something like a recording of the Cologne concert, you've got Keith Jarrett's performance, and we can listen to that performance. But there are lots of these layers of mediation in between that get the sound of the piano in that concert hall to us. So if you think it through, there are the microphones inside the piano, and those microphones are then going to mediate the sound. Then that's going to go into a tape recorder, which is also going to mediate the sound. That's then going to go into a recording studio where there's more mediation. Then it's going to go into a record, and that's another layer. So there are layers after layers after layers. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that when we listen to the record, we don't hear it as if we were there.
Yes.
Because a lot of people clearly hear that it's almost as if you're right there with him.
Yes.
And I think there are maybe two reasons for that. So I think one reason is simply that when you have a good live recording, it sounds live. That might seem really obvious, but when you can hear things like the audience and like the piano still squeaking and stuff like that, you're hearing things that you would associate with a concert hall. You're not hearing it like a recording studio, which can tend to be very, very clean, as if there is no extraneous foreign noise. So when you hear a good live recording, you know it's live because you can hear all these things.
Yes.
The more subtle bit of it, I think, is that I think we're culturally conditioned to hear live recordings as being something quite particular and quite special. Because part of the reason, I think, is that if you think about how recording artists choose which albums to issue, people like Keith Jarrett will only issue live albums when they're really exceptional performances, when they think they're really good, when they think the recording has captured something really, really good. So partly as a result, I think when we hear a live performance, I think we have a kind of inbuilt cultural propensity or inclination to hear it as kind of very unmediated, to hear it as if we're right there,
Right. So
even
our
though we're
mind is
not.
playing tricks on us in some sense, isn't it? Because we
Kind,
want.
kind of our
Yeah.
mind, but also sort of our cultural conception. I got to see Keith Jarrett play a few times, but one particular time I got to see him play in London with his trio with Gary Peacock and Jack DeJohnette. I was sat in the balcony right above Jack DeJohnette's drum kit. As a result, I couldn't really hear the piano very well. So that was my experience. I went to the concert, it was great, but I couldn't hear all that much piano. Then when the record came out, because they made a record of that performance and it
Inside
came
Out?
It's called,
Oh, it's something like
Inside
that.
Out, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
You can hear the piano perfectly. It's all perfectly balanced. So the experience of listening to the record of that concert is completely different from my experience of actually being there. Two completely different things. Same music, but two totally different things in my experience.
But strangely enough, I was at the concert and I had really good seats
Right.
in the Royal Festival Hall, but the piano was down in the mix, and it was very
Right.
odd.
Right.
You know, it was a very
Yeah.
strange experience because we got so used to listening to Jarrett, where the piano is obviously high in the
Yeah.
mix of a trio. So yeah, that's. I mean, I think that's really helpful, and I think it comes to one of the questions, which is, what do you think about Jarrett's vocal and pedal noises? Is this directly related to his emotional state, do you think? And does this help us get that sense of liveness when we're listening, Peter?
Yeah, I think it definitely helps us get that sense of liveness. I think in terms of what it means, I think that's quite a complicated question.
Okay.
So, um, I think first of all, one thing I'll say that I think is quite useful. There's a really nice article by an American scholar, I think called Jero Moreno, and it's all about Keith Jarrett's vocalizations. And what he argues basically is that your students might be aware, but there are a lot of critics who really don't like
Yes.
Jarrett's vocalizing. They
Yes.
really don't like it. And what Moreno says is that one of the reasons for that is that when you improvise, it's a very, very physical thing. I mean, playing all music is actually a very physical thing, but with improvisation, you can actually be really pushing your body because you're really engaging all your senses quite intensively.
Yes. Yes.
And so what he says is that actually maybe what's happening with the Jarrett vocalizations is it's like a trace of the process of improvisation bleeding through into the music. So it's something that you don't normally hear, that you're not normally aware of. It's like a manifestation of the physical difficulty and exertion coming through into the recording. And maybe people don't like it because we're not used to experiencing that. We're not used to hearing it. So that's what he says. I mean, my kind of stance on it is that I think Jarrett's vocalizations do not do one job. They do many different jobs, and you can't really tell. I think sometimes he vocalizes when he's reacting to something. So he's just played something or something that's just happened.
Right.
And the vocalization is a reaction to it. I think in other places the vocalization is a kind of a result of the effort. It's kind of a way of articulating how much exertion he's putting through his body and his mind. At other times, I also think the vocalizations are almost like an attempt to make something happen.
Yeah.
As if he's almost trying to push the music. And the way of doing that is almost to push it by vocalizing. So I think it's actually really complex. It's not one thing. I think potentially it's many different things. And you can't really tell which of those it ever is.
I guess it gives you a sense of the struggle in all those different ways of trying to improvise in the moment, when especially when you're on your own, right? And you've just got a piano. So yeah, that's great, Peter. Another question. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to just perhaps do a little musicological analysis, and you'd show us some bits and show us how musicology gives an insight in a way that would be lovely. But one of the questions I've got, and this, if the concert had happened in the studio, because it relates to this liveness question, would it be less popular, or is it possible that it could be as popular?
I don't think it would be anywhere near as popular, anywhere near, and I suspect it would never have happened in the studio in the same way.
Interesting.
I think if Jared had gone into the studio, it would simply not sound anything like that. I think clearly, as I say, when you listen to him talk, it's very clear that the way he improvises, it's so much to do with the context in which he's improvising. So he will talk about how on certain nights he feels the audience is absolutely with him, and if he feels the audience is right there with him and that everyone is on the same page, that doesn't really mean anything, but that everyone is connected, then he feels as if there's a successful performance happening. And he has recorded improvised music in the studio. There are quite a few albums of short piano pieces recorded in the studio. The most famous one is called Facing You, made in 1971, but
Yes.
as you may well know, there are quite a few others. But if you listen to them, they're very different from the solo concerts. Not so much that the music is that different, but there's a very different quality to them, to me. So yeah, I don't think the Cologne concert would have been anything like what it is if it had been done in the studio. I think it would be unrecognisable.
And are you able to use words to talk about the difference in those qualities, Peter, or is it something that's just an emotional reaction?
Okay, so in terms of words, in terms of musicological things, in terms of what Jarrett tends to do on those studio records, he tends to do shortest pieces, and every piece has a fairly kind of clear focus, and that he's maybe focusing on a particular set of harmonies or a particular way of approaching the piano or kind of piano figuration or something like that.
Yep.
The solo concerts are always moving through a lot of different material. And I think that kind of the reason they're popular, the reason they're so different, is the fact that they are a kind of journey. The fact that they're moving. And a lot of the drama, I think, is to do with how they move from one place to another.
Right.
That's one of the key things for me that's really different. That when you get these live concerts where he's playing for 40 minutes, if you're sitting listening to someone improvising for 40 minutes, I think you listen in a very specific kind of way. I think you start listening not just to the music, you start thinking about what is actually happening in the improvisation and what the improviser is experiencing. So I think you hear it almost like a reflection of what is happening to them internally. And I think that's very different across a 40-minute concert than it is for like 5 minutes in the studio. I think that's a very different thing.
That's so interesting, and so many of my students have used the word journey to describe their experience of listening to the Cologne concert for the first time, Peter. What did ECM do to make the Cologne concert so successful as from one of my students?
Okay. Well, I'm going to actually show you something in a minute. The answer is in certain ways, not that much. And I think part of the reasons are you have to remember that this is the 1970s.
Yes.
This record is being put out by what was at the time a fairly small German record label.
You're right.
But before 1975, that record label, ECM, didn't really have much of a foothold in America. They were getting some of their records into America, but as I understand it, they didn't really have a proper distribution deal to get those records really out around the world. When the Cologne concert came out, I don't think they really promoted it much differently from other Jarrett records. The one thing they did do, which I'll show you, is that one of the big things, certainly for promoting a record, certainly in the United States, was, if I can find it here, getting radio play.
So could you? I thought you were going to show your. Oh, you are. Share. Great. Thank you, Peter. So, we can see that. Yeah.
If you can see that, that is a
wow. I've not seen
cover
this.
of a promotional disc that would have been designed for radio play. It's the encore from the concert.
Yes.
You can see it says on the left-hand side, radio programming only, not for sale. So you wouldn't have found this in the shops. This would have been sent out to radio stations to encourage them to play, which would then have helped promote the record. Now, I'm not sure if ECM did this with other Jarrett records. They probably did. But they were obviously aware of how important radio play was for marketing. So that was one thing that they were certainly doing. Um, Beyond that, I haven't really seen, or when I did my research, I didn't really see that much in the way of radio ad, magazine adverts that much. There was certainly maybe a little bit, but it wasn't a big, extensive marketing campaign by any means. I don't think they approached it differently from really any other record. So I think the success that it had was to some degree unexpected. I don't think they quite expected it.
Do you think the way that they recorded it or the way that they cleaned up the sound? You mentioned that you think both those things had some agency. Do you think that was also to do with ECM, and perhaps an American label at the time didn't have the technology to record pianos so well, Peter, or something else?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm not. I know a bit about technology, but I'm no huge
Right,
expert.
fine,
But
yeah.
my understanding is that I don't think ECM had any different equipment from anyone else.
Okay.
The one thing they did have was a different kind of approach, and you might know the background to this, but the owner of ECM is a man called Manfred Eicher, who used to be a double bass player, but he actually spent a while working for Deutsche Grammophon, the German record label who recorded classical music. So his approach to recording was actually more towards the classical side in terms of how he approached miking the piano. To give you an interesting story, actually, I was able to interview, I think I mentioned this in the book, someone who promoted one of the earlier concerts on the tour. It was actually 2 weeks before the Cologne concert. And he said that what happened was that when Jarrett and Manfred Eicher arrived at the venue, I think he put up some microphones the promoter had. And Manfred Eicher said, "Oh, no, don't do it like that, do it like this." And he immediately went over and adjusted the microphones to how he
Right.
thought they should. So he knew how he wanted the piano to sound, and he knew how to put those microphones directly in place, very clearly. And the recording from that earlier concert is not publicly available, but I've heard it, and it's not at all bad. It's quite a good piano sound. So you can tell that Eicher knew what he was doing. And I think that's probably a slightly different approach from a lot of the American labels who would probably, I suspect, would probably not have had so much experience in recording solo instruments, would probably be more used to recording jazz groups, where you don't need a big piano sound, you just need a fairly simple piano sound that will sit in the mix with the
Yes.
drums and the bass and everything else. So I think that's an interesting difference, perhaps, in terms of the way ECM were operating, that they were able to get this very detailed piano sound.
Right, and that came from that classical background that Aisha
Definitely,
had,
yeah.
possibly. Um, I'm going to ask you to sort of take over in a minute and show us
Yeah.
what the musicological analysis, some insights, Peter. I'd love you to talk about those first 5 notes as well, if you don't mind. I've got one more question. Did audiences, at any point come just to see Keith Jarrett, or did they always come for the music? As one of the students, they're very keen to understand that.
That's a really, really good question. It's very hard to tell, but I suspect that increasingly people came to see Jarrett because of a kind of mystique that had built up around him. So I know that, talking to people who heard him and saw him play on that tour of Germany in 1975, well, it's actually a tour of Europe, which I'll get to in a minute, they were very clear that a lot of the popularity of it was to do with the drama of it, as they described it. That it was a really dramatic spectacle watching Jarrett play. Because as your students will probably know, when you watch him play, he does not sit still.
No.
He's moving around a lot, standing up from the piano, still moving around. So to them, it was very clear that it was a really dramatic spectacle watching one of these concerts. And I'm pretty sure that fed into the popularity the concerts generated, that people went to see him because it was this spectacle, definitely. And there's an interesting parallel here to, if any of your students are aware of, the great virtuoso pianists like Franz Liszt in the 19th century, there's a very clear parallel to the kind of spectacle of a performer's body, and that having a lot of expressive sort of implication in terms of the way people think about the music. Sorry, was there? I lost my thread. Was there another
No,
part
I
of
think
that
that
question?
I think that was.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was about. I mean, you talk about it in your book. There was almost a kind of like a folklore attached with Jarrett, a kind of devotion, this kind
absolutely,
of
yeah.
musical, spiritual leader, as well as just being,
Absolutely,
a
absolutely.
great jazz
Let me
musician.
just again, let me just show you something that kind of demonstrates that. I mean, and this kind of starts to go into the musicological analysis.
In fact, I'll hand over to you, Peter, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Here. Yeah, and you can take over, and
I'll
maybe
probably
you could
jump around a
also.
little bit.
Sorry, yeah. Oh wow! Oh, didn't see
What
this
I was going to
either.
say was I'll maybe talk a little bit about some of the background cultural things, and then maybe some of the music. But if I sort of pause after a little while in case you want to ask any questions. But one of the things that I thought I'd show you a little bit is that when I was doing research into this concert, I was trying to get a sense of how Jarrett was understood in America and how his music was understood in America in the 1970s. And you don't have to go very far before you find things like this. So this is a write-up from a small newspaper called the Montreal Gazette. And it's basically a kind of promotional piece about a forthcoming concert. But you can very clearly see, fine pianist plays mystical music. And you actually get a lot of little things like this attached to Jarrett. The idea that he's got this aura or this kind of slight mystique attached to what he does. So there are an awful lot of them, actually. So there's definitely something of that going on. And if it's okay, Mark, I was just kind of very briefly going to talk about another kind of musicological aspect of this. So if you'll just apologise the blank PowerPoint slide from me, I'll switch. So
Yeah.
we talked earlier about the kind of story behind the Cologne concert, of that how Jarrett got to the venue and the problems with the piano. And that story's been told again and again. But what I wanted to try to do was to go slightly further back,
Right.
to get a bit more context. So in other words, what was Jarrett doing in Germany in 1975? So as I've already mentioned, he was on a tour. But at the time I wrote this book, that was not really understood. So what I managed to track down very helpfully was, this is ECM's promotional brochure for this 1975 tour of Europe. And you can see, I hope, is that big enough? Can you see?
Yeah, I can see Cologne is the fifth one down or something like that.
Yeah. So there you go. So it starts in Kronach in Germany, then 2 more dates, then he goes to Lausanne in Switzerland, and that's the famous drive from Switzerland to Cologne to the Opera House. And then he's in Switzerland, Austria, in Graz, and then back to Germany, and then finally finishes in Paris. And you can start to kind of... I found that the Cologne concert made a lot more sense when you actually understand the context. That we see it as just one recording, it's a single standalone recording, but actually it's the middle of a tour and he's playing most nights, I was able to actually talk to the person who organised this concert, this very first concert in Kronach, and he told me that Jarrett had actually been skiing in the Alps and he'd come straight from the Alps to the concert. He was really fresh and ready to go. He had lots of ideas, so he obviously prepared himself by having a holiday beforehand. So obviously, when you have a performer doing something like this, they think about preparation. And you can see, quite interestingly, there are a lot of days where he has a day off. He's not playing every single night. There are a couple of days in the middle where he's building in a day off, and that kind of thing. I don't think that's accidental. That's deliberate, but it's part of giving us a picture of the context that goes into something like this, the context that goes into the performance. Just in case you want to see it, this is a ticket stub.
Can you zoom out? Oh yeah, perfect. Thank you, Peter.
January 1975. You can see only a bit of it, but you can see 372. I can't remember how many people were there, but there are a few hundred people.
1,400.
1,400. Okay, is that what I said? Okay.
Well, I listened to the one night only, the Paul Gambaccini thing with.
Oh right.
Yeah, that you mentioned in your book. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of nice little pieces of evidence for how it happened. And the kind of thing ECM were doing as well when they were promoting these concerts was, this is the kind of thing they'd do. They'd put together something to send out to promoters with kind of quotes from lots of magazines. So they're quoting Melody Maker from the United Kingdom about Jarrett,
Yes.
New Musical Express. These are all actually reviews. I think a lot of them are reviews of his last album solo concert. So they're trying to push out this message about why a promoter should think about booking Jarrett. And a lot of it is hinging on that last record. It's been described as a masterpiece.
Yes.
And so that's a lot of the way they're marketing him. So I just kind of stop showing this for a minute, and do you want to kind of come in on any of that before I launch into something else?
No, I think it's brilliant, and I suppose what I'm fascinated, Peter, is in kind of you deliberately are very interdisciplinary. You're interested in kind of cultural. You're showing me some of the artifacts there, so the history, how things were promoted, so a systems view, and of course you're a musicologist as well. So I'd love you just to show some of the insights that your musicological analysis, and perhaps
Yeah.
you can play us some things. Why is that important to you? Why do you need an interdisciplinary look to really understand something like the
Yeah.
concert? And then perhaps you can take over for a bit. That would be lovely.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that. So, first of all, while this might sound strange, I don't really think of what I do as being interdisciplinary.
Okay.
I think of what I do as just being musicology.
Okay.
But often the kind of definition of musicology, if you look at it, it's just the study of music.
Right.
It can mean specific things in specific contexts, but I've always sort of felt that in order to kind of understand if you're committed to really examining music and understanding what's going on, then you use whatever tools you need to.
I see.
The tools don't define who you are. What defines what you're doing is the subject and what you're getting out of it. So for me, it's always been about, I want to know about this. What's the best tool? So I'm trying to find the right tool that will tell me certain things. So when I wrote the book, I knew that it was important to have some analysis where I was actually looking at the music, but I also didn't want to have a whole book about that, because I knew there would be a lot of readers who would not read the book
Read
if it was
music.
completely analysis. So I know there are a lot of people who read the book and they skip the chapters that have got a lot of the analysis in it, and that's fine. I'm quite aware that people are going to do that. That's absolutely fine.
Yes.
But I felt it was important to get that in there because, for example, I know that I was talking to a pianist the other week who's actually been doing a little tour to celebrate the anniversary of the Cologne concert. And he's been doing improvisations based on ideas from the Cologne concert. So he told me that actually some of the ideas that came out of the analysis that I did fed into the way he thought about constructing his improvisation. So in a sense, there's a kind of, it's nice to hear that because you realize what the point of it is, that if you're creating something like that, it can be an insight that actually helps a musician find a new direction, and that's great. So that's kind of my approach to being, very interdisciplinary about it. But yeah, as you suggest, Mark, let me show you a couple of things.
Can I just ask
about,
whether you think
Yeah.
most musicologists, I mean, this is probably a little bit outside what the students want to know, but my curiosity, do most musicologists share your view that it's the study of music in all these historical, psychological experience, whatever all these things, or do some think it is you look at the score and you try to understand something just looking at the score? I mean, do you have a view on that?
I think probably most people would.
Yeah,
I
okay.
mean, I think certainly in the United States, there's sometimes a very rigid idea of very different disciplines within musicology. So we have something called music theory and something called historical musicology, and those things can often be treated as very different kinds of disciplines.
Okay.
So you will find examples where something is very clearly in one camp. It will talk about something historically but will not really get into any analysis, or something that will do entirely analysis and not deal with the history.
Got it.
But I think there are a lot of people out there who would maybe not do it quite the same way as I would do it, but they would have a similarly broad approach. And similarly, I have colleagues I work with here who have approaches to studying music that I don't ever use because I'm not trained to use them, and they don't feel right for me, but that doesn't mean they're not really interesting. So they would study music empirically by looking at the emotional response people have to music, by doing kinds of empirical measurement, or by doing interviews and things like that. And that's really interesting too, but that's not something I do. That doesn't mean it's not important. So I think you can't do everything. You've got to find your skill set and use that and be flexible, but also be aware that it's impossible to use every method there is out there. You just can't do that.
And that's really hard. And I got one more personal question for you. Do you think that you could just turn up and listen to something without knowing anything about the musicians or about what you're expecting? And how does that change your experience if you go and do the research and you understand, or listen to a record, or hear someone who was big in the 20 years ago? does my question make sense? Is it possible to
Yeah,
really
yeah.
experience music without any knowledge about anything else? Music just for the music, or does all of this help?
Yeah, I think it is. I'll qualify that. I think it is. I'd like to think that I can still listen to Jarrett and get the same kind of pleasure from it, and forget all the stuff that I've written about it and just listen to
Okay.
it. I think we can certainly
Right.
do that.
Right.
At the same time, I qualify it by saying I think that we always, when we listen, we always bring with us the cultural baggage of who we are and where we come from.
Right.
So we always hear things in a specific way, whether we like it or not. And that's the beauty of it. That's why no two people who listen to the Cologne concert will hear quite the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, a slightly strange example, but after I wrote the book, one of the things that became interesting was that some people clearly listen to the Cologne concert in a slightly different way from how I would ever listen to it. So, for example, I got a message from someone, I think he was an electrical engineer, and he told me, this is after the book had been written and come out, he told me that he used to use the Cologne concert to listen to at work. And he would listen to it every day of his working life for 20 years or something. And
Wow.
he'd put it on, and when it finished, he would start it again. And that was his soundtrack to the work he did. And it was because he found it very relaxing. So when he's working, that music is on constantly. And I imagine he's listened to it tens of thousands of times by
Yeah.
now.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I couldn't do that. I mean, yeah, sometimes I like having music on in the background, but I couldn't have the Cologne concert on all the time like that. I could not do that. But again, it just demonstrates that we have different ways of listening and different ways of using music. And that's a fascinating thing in itself.
Yeah, and it's what we're trying to encourage students to share their experiences and how they might change over the course, Peter. But
Yeah.
I'm really fascinated to just if you could just give us some insights into what happens in the music, that would be really helpful. Really lovely, in fact. Thank you.
Let's try and do this. Right, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. So this is. I hope this makes sense. This is, rather than show you all the music of the opening, I've tried to sort of do a kind of little reduction. So these are some of the opening chords, but I've tried to reduce it so you can just see the basic notes. So hopefully, if I play this, you can hear that. So that's the first chord. Is that coming through, Mark?
Yes,
Right.
it's coming through. Thank you, Peter. Yeah.
So there's a couple of things I'll point out here. So one of them is actually really, really simple, but really effective, which is that I said these are all very straight triads. He uses a lot of basic triads in the concert. But one of the things he does at the opening is there's a very particular sound that he gets that was becoming a very big part of the jazz language at the time. And it's a sound that either involves not using the third of the chord, or introducing a sound that we sometimes call a sus sound or an add sound, where you're adding a note into the chord. And it's very often to do with the second or the fourth. So this first chord, it's kind of a D7 sus4. What that means is if I play the bottom, it's an open fifth. It's a D and an A, which you associate with D major or D minor. But if you move up this chord, there is no third in that chord.
No. Right.
There's no F or no F sharp, because that would make it major or minor. But this chord is neither major or minor. So it has this very, in jazz we describe it as a very open sound. It sounds quite almost ambiguous, and you can't quite tell what it is. Is it major or minor? But that sound he kind of starts carrying through. So this second chord it's sort of an A minor chord, because we've got an A and an E and a C. But what you also have is the ninth and this note here. So you're getting this minor chord, but again it's sort of been enriched by adding these notes into it. And this third chord is the same, because it's an F triad with this G at the top. So you've got this major chord with this added note into it. And then finally,
And just to help my students, you call it an add 2 rather than an add 9
Yeah.
because there's no fifth. Is that right, Peter? No seventh.
This gets very nerdy, and I apologise,
yeah.
but we call it. We could call it add 9 instead of add 2. The reason I don't call it 9 is when you say F9, you start implying having the seventh as well.
Seventh, sorry, I meant the seventh, not
So
the,
yeah,
of course.
So when you have a 9 chord, it's slightly different from an add 9. This is one of the slight confusions. I think all that's really important is the idea of simply having a triad,
Right.
and adding the second note of the scale to it.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the key sounds you get in this opening. One of the things that you can also kind of start picking out from this that I find interesting is try to think about how you analyze this music knowing that it's improvised. Right. So instead of saying, well, the music is moving from this chord to this chord,
Right.
how can we analyze it with the understanding that this is improvised music? So one of the things that kind of interests me is what is Jarrett actually doing in this opening? So what he's doing is he's moving around different triads which are kind of roughly connected. So he's moving from more or less like that. Now if you wanted to be kind of analytical about it, you could kind of see how all these chords can kind of be related in some way or another. They're kind of roughly related to G major, with the kind of exception of that F chord. If you think of that F chord, you can think of that F chord as being built on the flattened seventh, which would be what we call a Mixolydian scale.
Yeah.
Now, that's not actually that important here, but all that kind of is really important to me is the idea that you've got this phrase that goes through 4 chords, and it finishes on a G. Now, what do you do as an improviser? You've just played 4 chords. Do you play the same 4 chords again next time? And he doesn't. He does something slightly different. Okay, he does that, basically. I'm taking out all the melody to kind of try and show you what's underneath. But if you look at what's happening there, the starting point is different. So he starts on a kind of open A chord, which doesn't have a third, and then moves down to E minor, and then D, but then he still goes F, G. So he's still finishing the phrase with the same 2 chords. And if you follow all the opening through like the list, there's a very subtle process like that, where he's building these kind of associations between chords. He's never playing quite the same thing twice, but it also doesn't feel really irregular and disconnected because he's associating chords. So you'll find this FG movement happening quite a lot, for example, at the end of the phrases. So that's sort of one interesting kind of thing about the start that's quite interesting, I think. And the other thing that then happens a bit later on is that...
Are we still in part 1, Peter?
We're still in part 1. We're still in
good.
part 1. So just trying to find the best example to show you. Okay, the best example to show you is probably this, actually. So what then happens gradually is Jarrett moves into this passage where he does something extremely simple from an improviser's point of view. So in most jazz, when you improvise, you're improvising melodically. You're improvising tunes or melodies. And you're often setting up an accompaniment. So in a very traditional jazz context, you have a band, maybe with piano, bass and drums, who are playing an accompaniment. And you have solo players who are improvising melodies over that accompaniment. So Jarrett's playing solo piano. So that means he has to be the accompaniment and the melody at the same time. He has to do 2 things at once.
Right.
So this kind of passage, and I'm not going to try and play this, but what's important here is actually the left hand. So Jarrett moves into this phase in the solo concert in part 1, where he spends quite a long time just moving between A minor and G. And all he does in his left hand is play these very simple triads, just sustaining each note, while his right hand does these very long, elaborate lines, and then down to G like that. So it's almost the simplest device you can imagine as an improviser. You just find 2 chords,
Right.
and you sort of move between them, alternating between them regularly, and then you create a new melody over the top. That's extremely simple as a way of approaching it. But the thing I find really interesting is the way in which, if you follow this kind of line in this part of the concert, Jarrett starts with this A minor G thing, and then gradually he starts transforming it very subtly into something different. So if I show you this example, I've had to excerpt this from my book, but I'll try and show you what I mean. So later on, that thing I've just shown you, he's playing this with these long melodic lines going on in his right hand. Yeah, a bit like that. All this kind of, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And it's what we call out of time. There's no clear pulse to it. But he also starts moving between that and passages which use the same chords but move into time. So at one point he starts going. So it's just moving between A minor and G again. But this time you've got what we call a feel or a groove to it. So it's an extremely simple technique, but it's really effective because you've got this very simple musical material sort of being stretched out, but you're moving between what we might call rubato or out of time and into groove and then back again. And it's extremely effective. But then what he does, as you start getting further in, he starts turning this A minor G into a chord sequence. So what you've got here in the top line here, if you follow it, I'm moving between A minor and G, but now he's throwing other things into it, like this D7. So you go A minor. So he's throwing a chord in between the A minor and G, which we would call a secondary dominant in jazz theory. And then he's throwing in another one at the end of the G that gets you back to A minor. So it's the same progression, but when you add these chords in, all of a sudden you start getting a slightly different kind of feel to it altogether. I'm afraid I can't even remember the timings, like to give you the specific moment.
Okay, yeah, no, it's fine. We can look for that. We can look for that going back. So you're saying that he does a couple of things, as I understand it, Peter. You're first of all saying that he moves in and out of rubato into a fill, and he does that quite successfully. But you're also saying that as this A minor to G progresses, what he does is he complexifies the harmonics. So he uses more chord transitions to develop things. Okay.
So if I maybe actually just for a minute see if I can switch to the piano view, and I'll try and show you what I mean. I'm sure everyone can hear it, but it might make more sense if I try and show you with this. With apologies, hopefully you can see this. I'll just move this around very slightly like that. So he's doing this A minor G thing, and he's now moved it into a groove like this. So he's moving between those two chords.
Yes.
But what we do now is, instead of just going from the A minor to the G, we do something that jazz musicians do all the time, which is we throw another chord in. And do you want me to go through the idea of a secondary dominant, Mark, really quickly?
Yes, yeah, why not? Yeah.
Okay, so I apologize if this is actually a really simple idea. You might know the idea of the dominant, which is the 5 chord in classical theory. In jazz, you can put a dominant before any chord, and it's called a secondary dominant. So to get from A minor to G, instead of going from A minor to G, I go to A minor, and then I go to the chord a fifth away from G, and make it the dominant 7th. Go to G. So I'm going A minor, and then I'm going to do the same thing going to A minor. Like that. So, yeah, very simply like that. And then another thing that he does a bit later is that, again, this is a very typical jazz thing. He changes that A minor suddenly to become
major,
and you get this dominant 7th. And this starts then to move into what I feel is a very bluesy, gospel-y sound. So you get. And then he'll do this. A bit like that. Not doing it very well, but you get the idea. So yeah, you've got this very simple progression that he's slightly complexifying. But as he's adding these things into it, to me, the kind of see if I can switch this back. The sort of feel or the color of the music changes really subtly as he does that. So although it's A minor G, you get these little changes in color that are happening really subtly, and it's really interesting to see the way that he's got this long span of music, which is just starting from 2 chords, but is really carefully following this kind of journey, this line, by using those techniques.
It's interesting you say that, Peter. I mean, I have 2 very favourite moments, and it's exact. If I just play you my favourite moment, it's at 9:38. I don't know if you can hear it, and it's just so he breaks it down, and then he goes into this incredible ostinato. And for me, every time I listen, I find it so he's done what you suggested. He's sort of broken it down. He's gone into rubato, and then he picks up a kind of ostinato, I guess. Here we go. Back into time. I find that so beautiful. Every time it does. It's one of those moments that does it for me every time. I'm actually going to ask you what your favourite moments are, but just because you were talking about that, I just had to play that, and I think my students know by now because I keep playing that over and over again. So he also kind of moves, not just into time, but into kind of a groove, as you say, like a gospel or a blues, whatever you'd call it. I don't really know, but
well, so that's one of the kind of interesting things about his piano technique, and I'll just put my camera up again to show you. Yes. I think you've again hinted at this already, Mark, but one of the things that makes him really interesting as a piano, I mean, I imagine you probably have people watching this who are piano players.
Yes, absolutely. Many of us.
Jarrett's hands are not very big. So with my hand, I can reach an octave fine.
Yes.
I can reach a ninth, not too hard. A tenth, I have to really stretch a little bit. Jarrett's hands are even smaller than mine. So I think he talked about how he really had to work on building his strength and almost pulling his thumb out so that he could get quite wide intervals, because he couldn't naturally get something like a ninth. But one thing that he does a lot, and I think this is almost maybe one of the most distinctive things about the way he plays, is he can do these groove passages where he's simply using something like an octave with his left hand, doing that. And what he will do is, rather than just have his left hand doing a groove like this, he will do a groove, but his groove will involve the thumb on his right hand, along with his left hand. So sometimes he'll do... So you'll get both thumbs doing that, or doing something where his left hand's doing that and his right hand's maybe... And sometimes you get this thing also where the right thumb and the left thumb will kind of alternate in something like this. I'm not doing a Jarrett impression very well, but that's kind of become a really quite distinctive thing in the jazz piano language, and very few, if anyone, was doing it quite like that before Jarrett.
Wow.
And there's some very typical examples in the Cologne concert, particularly the beginning of part 2, where he has that D major vamp. He's working exactly like that. That's a very typical piano style thing, and it's the interesting thing about that is it's so much to do with the physicality of how his hands work. It's really kind of wired into the way he uses his hands.
It's so funny. Today we were looking at the ostinato, which is, I think, from 1984, where he plays this insane ostinato, and I think he stretches. And he's doing exactly what you just said. I can't remember.
Is that the encore from Tokyo? 1984?
Yeah, 1984. It is.
Well, I'll tell you something interesting about that.
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and find the sources and remember, but
yes,
that is one of those pieces at the end of a solo concert that appears to be improvised. Right? It's not. Because I can trace that one back to, I think, 1973 sometime.
That's very interesting.
So he's actually playing. I found a recording somewhere where that thing exactly crops up right in the middle of it, and it's about 10 years earlier.
You say something quite profound, if I may. You say something like, because it reminds. So we all thought it was. I certainly thought it was improvised, and I thought the final track
Yeah.
was improvised, and it turns out, I think either you discovered it or someone discovered it. There was a recording from 10 years earlier where he plays a slow version at Berkeley College or something like that, Peter.
Yeah.
And then what you say
Yeah,
is, you make
sorry,
this.
yeah, that one's
Yeah, sorry, go on. Please, you go first. Yeah.
that one is quite well known because basically the story is that it crops up on the Cologne concert as called Part 2C. But if you look in the real book, which is this book of tunes came out of Boston in the 1970s,
Yes.
the same tune is in there, and it's called Memories of Tomorrow, and it has
Yes.
that title on it. And basically, I write about this in the book, but clearly what's happened is that Jarrett had this piece because he was clearly playing tunes as encores. So when he's playing an encore, often it's clear he was playing something he'd originally written, even if
Okay.
it wasn't known to everyone. Clearly, that was the case. The more interesting case is that do you know the Sunberg concerts? Well, some of your
Yes.
students might have heard of them.
We've actually
So
been
there's
playing the
actually-
encore from that as well, which is incredible.
Okay.
Yeah.
You probably know Kyoto. That one?
We haven't looked at that one. Is that Sunbear, is it?
Okay. It's Sunberg.
Yeah.
It's absolutely jaw-droppingly beautiful. The beginning
Right.
of Kyoto.
Okay.
Again, you listen to it and you think, how on earth, how did he come up with that? Turns out there's a recording of his European quartet a couple of months before, and in a little interlude, he plays exactly the same thing.
Okay. Right.
So that didn't come from nowhere. That was, even if it wasn't a composition, that was something that was worked out that came back.
Yeah. And if you look at it, Memories of Tomorrow sounds quite different because he comes in and plays a tune right from the beginning, doesn't he?
Exactly.
But-
And if you follow it through, it's got a perfect structure. It's always the same chords, round
Yes.
and round.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
doesn't generally happen in the improvised bits. Yeah.
No, it's really clear. But you say something also quite proud. You say that there's a kind of judgment that listeners make that they privilege spontaneity over composition in your book, and I thought that's exactly right, because when I found out that actually it wasn't totally improvised, I went, oh, I felt sort of let down almost. But of course,
Yeah.
he's not trying to hide that, is he? But I think it's a nice point, and I was going to ask you why you think we do that, Peter, and
I think we still have a lot of cultural misconceptions about what improvisation is. And I think some of those are the idea that it's somehow something superhuman and mystical and magical.
yes,
Yes. And it's really not. Because if you think about it, if you have a conversation with someone, that's improvisation. We do that all the time, every single day. So why is music any different from that? Right? Or the other way I think of it is, if you think about improvisation in that sense, if you think about anyone like Jarrett or a jazz musician who improvises all the time, if they were to play something completely new every single time, how is that possible?
yeah.
I mean, that's just not possible. I mean, we have a conversation. We don't say something we've never said before in every phrase. We just don't do that. We riff off things we've said before. We occasionally will come up with a new thought, but we'll express it maybe in a different way. And that's what improvisers do. The greatest example that might be worth mentioning, and this is a slight tangent, but I'll mention this just in case it's helpful. Sometimes the greatest improviser in jazz is mentioned as being Charlie Parker, the great
Right.
bebop saxophonist
Yes.
of mainly from the 1940s. And lots of people who played with him described his almost superhuman ability to stumble into a nightclub having been on drink and drugs and play these incredible solos.
Yes.
Well, there's been a lot of analyses done of Charlie Parker solos, and basically what we know now is that practically every single phrase he played was not new. He played it before. And every Charlie Parker solo is a patchwork of little phrases that he'd obviously learned and worked out had to meld together. He never plays the same combination twice, but almost everything he plays, you can find a recording where he's played that before. So there's almost nothing new. It's for if Charlie Parker is a great improviser, that means that being a great improviser is not about playing new things, because he didn't play new things. He played brilliantly, but it's not about newness. That's something else.
That's so interesting. We sort of emphasize originality, don't we, sometimes over kind of an embodied, ongoing, moment-to-moment creative
Yeah,
process. And
absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's. Just before we zoom out again, now there's a few final questions I'd like to ask you, Peter. Can I just ask you about those first five notes? Because I heard a story that it was from the Colne, because I happened to be there with my partner very recently, that it was from the cathedral.
Yeah.
But then that was trumped when I read the book. But the received wisdom, and I don't know if you know it's true, is that it was the bell getting people into the auditorium
Yeah.
on time. Have we established that that is the case, even though Jack?
I don't know. I don't know if we have. I don't know if we have. But the one thing that I only found out when I was writing the book was that if you listen really carefully on headphones or on a really good quality stereo, when Jarrett plays that,
Yeah.
there's a little bit of laughter in the auditorium.
Yes,
You can clearly hear it. So they all heard it, and it was some kind of joke. They recognised immediately what was happening. The story I heard was it was the bell to call the audience into the hall. It could have been the church bells.
Yeah, I heard another story. That was all. But
as I was saying before, there's so many stories. It's often hard to know what's true and what's not.
And every time we remember something as human beings, we change the memory. Apparently, if you're a neuroscientist.
Yeah.
So there's a few more questions, Peter. If you just got 5 more minutes, I wouldn't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your favourite moments in the Colne concert? Is one of the questions.
I think I'm trying to remember where it is now. I've mentioned this. It's about 20 minutes and 20 seconds into the first part.
Yes.
And it's this moment where he has this sort of rolling arpeggiated chord. He does this. And I think, I can't remember if I wrote about this in the book. I might well have. You may well have picked up on it. I think the reason I love that is it seems like it steps out of the momentum of what had been happening up to that.
I see.
It's almost all of a sudden there is this sound, and he's quite happy just to play one sound and not to have anything else happen. There's this kind of stillness at that point. And I always heard that almost as one of those moments where he just finds something, where he plays a chord, and it's almost as if, having played the chord, he decides, actually, that chord is so nice, I don't need to play anything else.
Right.
I'll just play it again, and that's perfectly adequate. And I always heard it that way, rightly or wrongly, that it was sort of like a lot of things, it was unplanned, it just happened, because he would not normally just sit on a single chord like that in such a static way. So yeah, I've always loved that moment.
Fantastic.
For that, I think for that reason. Yeah.
So you're saying there's something about just going, oh my God, this is beautiful. I don't need to do anything else at the moment.
Yeah.
And we could all learn from just like doing that when life feels really good, just enjoy that moment and perhaps not try and move on too quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do I have any? I have a couple of final questions. So one student says, I want to learn to improvise on the piano. How important is this concert from an educational perspective? How can a pianist learn from this concert to help them approach improvisation for themselves?
I think on the question of is this concert useful, I think it might be, but for anyone wanting to improvise, I would say have an open mind, and you must find what is useful to you.
Right.
I think it's a very, very individual journey when you're learning to improvise, and Keith Jarrett will really speak to some people, and it really will not speak to other people. And whichever camp you fall into, that is absolutely fine.
Yes.
So don't feel that you have to study this if you want to learn to improvise at all. In terms of, does it help you learn to improvise? I'm not sure. I think maybe one thing that it might help with is what I was talking about before, which is the idea that you don't need complex materials. You don't need to have lots of complicated chords. You can work with very simple material, but it's all about what you do with it. So that example of the A minor and the G, it's extremely simple harmony, but it's the way it's manipulated and stretched and changed from rubato to groove and back. It's the way he's manipulating those very simple things in such an effective way. So if you want to take something from the concert, to me, it's that you can do an awful lot with simplicity. Yeah. And sometimes it's better to start with simplicity. Don't aim for complexity. because complexity can become a trap in itself. So
Do you know
it's
what's
almost
funny,
better to
Peter?
start with simplicity.
I think it's, as a jazz musician, I don't know if you know this, but sometimes if I try things that are too complex and I'm not really intending them, I'm being overly complex and it's just out of my abilities. That's the truth. And I lose it. I lose myself. Like when we're speaking and we're trying to show off or something, we lose that connection, don't we, with our inner selves? And that's a mistake. Um,
There's another question actually,
yeah,
Mark, I thought was really
yeah.
worth addressing. It's a really difficult one. I think a student had asked a question about feeling nervous
Yes, I can read
about
this out
playing
for you
wrong
now.
notes. You got that?
I'm a musician who is afraid of making a mistake in a concert. How can I overcome this problem? And will learning more about improvisation and the concert help me? Is that the question that you were
That's
right?
the
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
I think that's a really, really good question.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid I don't have a great answer, but I thought it would be worth trying to address. And I think the first thing I wanted to say is that I don't think we should think that because improvisers make music up from nothing that they don't suffer from nerves.
Right.
I think they do just as much as other musicians. But I think sometimes that nervousness manifests itself differently. So if you're playing music that is fully notated and you're expected to play all the right notes, your nervousness may well relate to, am I going to play a wrong note? For improvisers, I think it tends much more to manifest as, I don't sound very good.
Right.
Or this thing that I'm playing sounds like
Yes.
rubbish and it sounds meaningless. Right? Now, it's very difficult to find an answer to that. And I know I've heard lots of really quite distinguished, high-profile jazz musicians who still suffer from nerves. So it's not, I don't think it is something that we should think that we can overcome. It would be really nice to think that, but I think it's almost part of who we are as humans, that whenever we do something that's important, that we will be nervous about it.
Yes.
I think that's kind of part of the nature of who we are. But one of the things about the Cologne concert that's interesting, I'll tell you another story about this, is, as I said, Jarrett made it when he was extremely tired. I remember quite a few years ago, when I was teaching, I was examining here, I was examining performance exams, and it was a whole group of students that I taught, and I had one drummer, and he got up, and I thought he played quite a lot better than I'd ever heard him play. He just felt like he was really in the spirit of the music. Do you want to guess what I found out afterwards?
He'd been to the pub.
The night before.
Oh, okay, fine.
He hadn't
Okay.
slept the night before.
Yeah.
Right?
Fantastic. Yeah.
I'm not going to in any way suggest that any of us do that during a performance, but isn't it really interesting that somehow it's when we let everything drop away that we can really, really play.
That's so interesting.
Now, it's extremely difficult, but there's no way of addressing this. But if you are interested, there's a really interesting book, and I'm not sure I completely recommend it, but if you're interested, there's a book by an American jazz musician called Kenny Werner. It's called Effortless Mastery. And he has developed an entire philosophy about trying to play from, I think he'd probably call it no intention. So trying to learn to play notes in the most natural way possible without having any kind of mental thought or commentary about what is happening. Trying to play in a very pure way. And it's not easy at all, but he has some very interesting thoughts about it. So if you are interested and you want to explore that would be a good place to look at. But I'd also say that I don't think we can ever truly get over that. We have to learn to live with it in whatever the most appropriate way is.
And I've got one final question, but before I get to that, is this theory of Werner, because we've got some researchers working in the state of flow in music, is it connected to the state of flow where you lose a sense of yourself?
I think he would probably describe it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, for example, one of the things he talks about on the piano, which is really interesting, is the idea that you practice by literally putting. Sorry, this is a bit of a detour, Mark, but I might.
No, it's great. Fantastic. If you've got another few minutes, that's wonderful. Yeah.
Just really simply, you put your hand on the piano like this, and all you practice doing is just doing a single finger drop, where you drop your finger onto a key. But the key thing is you do it with each finger one at a time. But the key thing is you lift up your finger, and you try to play the note without an intention. So you don't play the note by telling your finger to do that, as we normally do. You try and let your finger drop naturally in the most effortless way possible. Now,
It's quite hard, isn't it?
it's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very counterintuitive. But interestingly, if you do it for just a little while, you can start to feel just something about a slightly different way of playing. And, I don't think it's easy to do, but I think he's onto something about the relationship we have with our instruments and the kind of physical tension we have when we play. So there's definitely something there.
Golly. And it's so funny because I sort of understand it in one way, but in another way I'm quite keen because some of our students now are having a go with me just in C major or C pentatonic, and it's that idea of intention, which is almost like, well, can you hear it before you play it, and then you're going to mean it. And so, some sense, there's another side to any kind of philosophy about doing anything in life, isn't there? That somehow maybe that's not the way to think about what it is to let go, to let go into.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, I suppose this is the final question, because you have taught across classical and jazz and pop. Do you think, and I would say most of our students are either pop musicians or classical musicians, but do you think that trying to understand improvisation, even if you don't explore it as a musician, just listening to it, sort of thinking about what that means, do you think that helps us becoming better pop composers or better classical musicians? Do you have any sense of that at all, or anything to say about that?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a big question.
Is it? I hope the answer is yes, because
yes. I mean, in the sense that I think generally we become better musicians by being curious.
Yeah. Okay.
First of all. So I mean, I've been doing a research project recently where I'm interviewing a lot of British jazz musicians about various things.
Right.
And one of the things that kind of comes up is just how when you talk to really talented musicians, how hard they work about just being curious, about finding music that they don't understand and trying to understand how it works.
Wow.
Very simply. And I think that applies in every kind of music. If you're curious and you're willing to find things that you're interested in and that you like, and then spend some time understanding what's happening, I think that's the most important thing. I mean, for example, I regularly kind of sometimes I'll hear a song that I really like, a pop song or a song by a British band, and I'll think, maybe I'll just spend 5 minutes with that, and I'll sit down and I'll listen to it and go, oh, right, I understand what's happening there. I could use that for a class because that song is doing this thing. And it's just that ability to be curious about anything that you hear that you like, whether it's Bach, whether it's improvised music, whether it's music from Africa, Morocco. I think that, to me, that characterizes a lot of the great musicians. They have this curiosity, and they're incredibly open-minded about things. They don't have fixed ideas, but also not thinking that there are particular things that we should be studying. I mean, I know we're told that we should study this and that, but I think it has to be quite a personal thing, that you find things that you're really interested, that really speak to you, and really explore those things.
That is incredibly helpful because we're all doing reflective diaries, and that's the one thing I've said is just be authentic, find out, try to work out who you are and what moves you and what excites you about music. So that's incredible. And I have one, so I'm burning question. I'm so sorry.
Okay,
do you think that's why Jarrett went into the classical world in such a, he obviously didn't make the same name for himself, but he has had great reviews, and he plays sort of like in a much more egoless way, I guess. And do you think it was about just a new challenge, or curious to see what it would be like to be a classical musician? Do you have any sense of why he did that, Peter?
That's a really good question, because I'm not sure I do, actually.
No, right.
I'm not really sure I do. I mean, he did have quite a deep classical training. There's a story that he went to study, or had the opportunity even to go to Paris at one point to study, and turned it down. I think
Nadia Boulanger or something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, which is quite a prestigious opportunity to turn down. Right. More generally, though, it's a very good question, because I'm not really sure. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that, this famous story that he tells, that when I think in the 80s, he spent quite a while doing classical music, and he kind of sort of reached a point of burnout where he really had to stop, because it was clearly affecting him quite badly for one reason or another, and he felt like, I think the way he described it, he'd sort of become divorced from a part of himself, or from a creative part of himself.
Yeah.
But clearly he managed to redress that balance, because when he was still making classical recordings occasionally during the 90s, he was obviously more balanced about it in some way or another. So I'm not really sure of the answer, actually, but I think he always approached anything he did with 100% commitment.
Yes, totally.
Extremely single-minded. So I'm sure there must have been a very clear motivation. Yep. He wouldn't have done something just because he felt like having to go at it.
No.
It would have been something really serious. But yeah, I'm afraid I don't actually know the answer to that one. Or any answer I think is decent.
Well, we're showing that we're both curious and that we don't know all the answers, which is a really important, perhaps a great way to finish this. So, Peter, I couldn't be more grateful to you. Thank you for a wonderful book.
No,
and thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Really,
and maybe one day we'll invite you over here and you can come and talk to us in the flesh. So thank you very much indeed. It's been an absolute pleasure, Peter, to meet you.
Oh, thank you very much for watching, and all the very best with your studies.
Great. So
great.
We'll cut it